The day the Galactic Council decided to classify Earth as a Category 7 planet was the day they sealed their own fate. They just did not know it yet. Ambassador Vrektal of the Dominion stood before the great holographic display, his 4 arms crossed in what passed for contempt among his species. The blue-skinned diplomat had served on the council for 300 cycles, and he had seen many primitive worlds. But this one, this little ball of dirt and water spinning around an unremarkable yellow star, seemed particularly worthless. "Look at them," he said to his fellow council members. "They have not even achieved faster-than-light travel. They still burn dead organic matter for energy. They fight wars among themselves over invisible lines drawn in the dirt." The other representatives murmured in agreement. There were 12 species on the Galactic Council, each one ancient and powerful. The youngest among them had achieved space travel over 50,000 years ago. Earth's first satellite had gone up less than a century before this meeting. High Chancellor Moravine, a being made of crystalline light who spoke in musical tones, pulled up more data on the humans. Their average lifespan is less than 100 cycles. They reproduce slowly. They cannot survive in vacuum, extreme heat, or extreme cold without artificial protection. Their planet is 70% covered in water, yet most of them cannot breathe underwater. "Fragile," declared General Krathium of the hegemony, his massive insectoid body clicking with amusement. "Soft, weak." The council voted unanimously to classify Earth as Category 7, which meant the planet was considered too primitive, and its inhabitants too underdeveloped to be worth contact. The humans would be left alone to either destroy themselves or perhaps, in another 10,000 years, reach a point where they might be worth acknowledging. "A pity," Ambassador Vrektal said as he recorded his vote. "They have a certain creative spirit, I suppose, but creativity without power is meaningless." The others agreed. What could a species accomplish when it could not even leave its own solar system? What threat could they pose when their most advanced weapons were still based on physics that the council species had moved beyond eons ago? The humans were an interesting curiosity, nothing more. The vote was recorded, the file was closed, the council moved on to more important matters. They did not notice the small probe that had been orbiting Earth for the past decade, sent by a race called the Vethkai. The Vethkai were not on the council. They had been rejected membership 500 years ago for being too aggressive, too hungry for expansion. They had spent those 5 centuries building their fleet in secret, waiting for the right moment. And they had found what they believed would be the perfect testing ground for their new weapons. Commander Sylvath of the Vethkai invasion fleet reviewed the data on Earth with great satisfaction. Her pale gray skin reflected the light of her command screen as she scrolled through information about human military capabilities. "Chemical propellant weapons," she said to her second-in-command. "Explosive projectiles. A few crude nuclear devices they are too afraid to use." She laughed, a harsh sound like metal scraping against stone. "This will not be a conquest, it will be a demonstration." The Vethkai plan was simple. They would conquer Earth in a single day, enslaving its population and stripping the planet of resources. Then they would broadcast the victory to the entire galaxy, proving that the Galactic Council was weak and that the Vethkai were the true power in the universe. No one would come to help the humans. Category 7 planets were beneath the Council's notice. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the Vethkai would have established a fortress world in an unclaimed sector of space. The invasion fleet consisted of 200 warships, each one capable of destroying a continent. They dropped out of hyperspace just beyond Earth's moon, their sudden appearance causing chaos among the primitive satellites and space stations orbiting the planet. On Earth, astronomers were the first to notice. Then the military. Then everyone else, as the massive ships became visible to the naked eye, blocking out patches of stars like dark clouds rolling across the night sky. The Vethkai did not bother with negotiations. Why would they? These creatures were barely more advanced than the livestock on their home world. Commander Sylveth simply broadcast a message on all frequencies, her words translated into every human language by the ship's computers. People of Earth, you are now property of the Vethkai Empire. Surrender your world, your resources, and yourselves to our control. Resistance will be met with complete annihilation. You have 1 hour to respond. The hour passed in chaos. World leaders scrambled to communicate with each other. Military forces went on high alert. Ordinary people looked up at the sky and felt true fear for the first time in their lives. When no unified response came, Commander Sylveth smiled. Begin the landing. Target their major population centers first. Show them what happens to those who do not kneel. The first wave of Vethkai troops descended on New York City. They expected screaming, they expected running, they expected surrender. What they got was something very different. The Vethkai soldiers were tall, heavily armored, and equipped with energy weapons that could cut through steel. They landed in Central Park, 2,000 of them, forming into perfect combat formations as their dropships lifted away. For exactly 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then the first shot rang out. A Vethkai soldier stumbled, a hole punched through his armor by a bullet that should not have been able to penetrate it. The humans had been studying the alien materials through long-range scans since the fleet arrived. They had already figured out the weak points. More shots followed, from rooftops, from windows, from the streets themselves. The people of New York had not run. They had armed themselves. Commander Sylveth watched the feeds from orbit with growing confusion. What is happening? These creatures should be fleeing in terror. Commander, one of her officers reported, his voice uncertain. Our ground forces are reporting heavy casualties. The humans are fighting back. That is impossible. They are Category 7 primitives. But it was not impossible. It was happening. All across the planet, wherever troops landed, they found not cowering prey but something else entirely. Something the Galactic Council had not thought to measure when they classified Earth. They had measured technology. They had measured lifespan. They had measured physical capabilities. They had not measured heart. In Beijing, an elderly grandmother shot a Vethkai soldier with a rifle that had belonged to her father. In Moscow, factory workers armed themselves with whatever they could find and charged alien positions. In Lagos, in Cairo, in Sao Paulo, in cities and towns across every continent, the story was the same. The humans were not surrendering. They were not running. They were fighting. And somehow, impossibly, they were winning. The first day of the invasion ended not with Earth's capitulation, but with something no one in the galaxy had expected. The Vethkai had lost nearly 30,000 soldiers on the ground, their advanced weapons and armor proving far less effective than anticipated against an enemy that simply refused to accept defeat. In every city where the aliens had landed, the story was the same. The Vethkai had expected to find civilians cowering in their homes, waiting to be collected like livestock. Instead, they found barricades built from cars and furniture. They found traps constructed from household materials. They found people of all ages, all backgrounds, all walks of life standing together with whatever weapons they could find. A retired Marine in Houston organized his neighborhood into a fighting unit within hours of the first landing. A group of high school students in Paris figured out how to disable alien communications equipment using jury-rigged jammers. A village in Kenya, with nothing but machetes and farming tools, managed to kill 17 Vethkai soldiers before dawn. Commander Sylveth paced the bridge of her flagship, her calm demeanor cracking for the first time in her long career. The reports coming in made no sense. Her soldiers were trained warriors, veterans of dozens of campaigns. The humans were supposed to be primitive, disorganized, weak. They are using our own weapons against us, an officer reported. The ones dropped by fallen soldiers. They are figuring out how they work within minutes." "Impossible," Sylveth said, but she was beginning to realize that word no longer meant what she thought it did. On the surface of Earth, something remarkable was happening. Humans had always been divided by borders, by languages, by ideologies. But when the alien ships appeared in the sky, those divisions seemed to matter much less. Nations that had been rivals for centuries were sharing intelligence. Scientists from different countries were working together to analyze captured alien technology. Soldiers from armies that had never fought alongside each other were coordinating their attacks. Dr. Sarah Chen was one of those scientists. A physicist from MIT, she had been on vacation in London when the invasion began. Now she stood in a makeshift laboratory beneath the streets of the city, surrounded by pieces of Vethkai equipment that resistance fighters had collected from the battlefield. "Their energy weapons use a crystalline power source," she said to the assembled team, which included researchers from 6 different countries. "If we can understand how it works, we might be able to replicate it, or at least disrupt it." A German engineer named Klaus nodded, his hands already moving over one of the alien devices. "The frequency is unusual but not beyond our understanding. Give me 12 hours. He had it figured out in 4. The humans called it the disruption field. It was crude compared to Vethkai technology, built from parts scavenged from old televisions and microwave ovens and jury-rigged together with whatever wire and solder could be found. But when activated, it caused the alien energy weapons to fail completely. The first test of the device happened in the ruins of downtown Chicago. A Vethkai patrol had been moving through the streets, hunting for survivors. They never saw the group of humans hiding in the collapsed remains of a department store. When the patrol opened fire on a decoy, their weapons sputtered and died. Before they could understand what had happened, the humans were on them with knives and baseball bats in bare hands. Word of the victory spread through the underground communication networks that had sprung up across the planet. Within days, disruption field generators were being built in basements and bunkers everywhere. Commander Sylveth finally understood that she had made a terrible mistake. "Request reinforcements from the home world," she ordered. "We need more troops, many more." But the home world was far away, and the message would take weeks to arrive. In the meantime, the Vethkai were trapped on Earth with an enemy they had grievously underestimated. General Marcus Williams had served in 3 wars before the aliens came. He had thought he understood combat. He had thought he understood courage. But watching ordinary people, civilians with no military training, stand and fight against an enemy from the stars showed him that he had barely scratched the surface. "They made one big mistake," he said during a strategy meeting in a bunker beneath what had once been the Pentagon. "They assumed that because we fight among ourselves, we cannot fight together. They assumed that because we are fragile, we are weak. They assumed that because we have not traveled to the stars, we are not dangerous." He looked around the room at the assembled commanders from a dozen nations, all of them united for the first time in human history. They were wrong about all of it. The counterattack began 2 weeks after the initial invasion. The humans had spent that time learning, adapting, preparing. They had studied the tactics and found the patterns. They had analyzed the alien biology and found the weaknesses. They had captured enough equipment to arm a small army. And they had something the Vethkai did not expect. They had hope. The Battle of New Delhi was the turning point. The Vethkai had established a major base there, using the captured city as a staging ground for operations across Asia. They had 20,000 troops, heavy weapons, and total air superiority. The humans had determination. The attack came at dawn, coordinated across multiple fronts. Indian soldiers who had been fighting a guerrilla campaign for weeks launched the main assault, supported by Chinese special forces who had crossed the Himalayas on foot. Pakistani troops who had been traditional rivals of the Indians fought alongside them without hesitation. Old enemies became brothers in arms, united against a common foe that threatened them all. The fighting was brutal. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Streets became rivers of debris and worse. But the humans pressed forward, using every piece of cover, every shadow, every advantage their knowledge of the terrain gave them. The Vethkai were pushed back, street by street, building by building. Every time they regrouped, the humans were there, hitting them from a new direction. Every time they tried to call for air support, the disruption fields made their communications fail. Every time they thought they had established a defensive position, some human found a way around it, through it, or simply through it by sheer force of will. By sunset, the base had fallen. For the first time in the invasion, the humans had liberated an entire city. Commander Sylveth received the news on her flagship and felt something she had never felt before in her long career. Fear. They should not be capable of this, she said to no one in particular. Our simulations said they would break within the first day. They should have given up. But the humans had not given up. They would not give up. The Vethkai had come to Earth expecting to find prey. Instead, they had awakened something far more dangerous. They had awakened humanity. 3 months into the invasion, the war had changed completely. The Vethkai still held their ships in orbit, still controlled the skis, but on the ground they were losing. Badly. Across the planet, human resistance had grown from scattered fighters into coordinated armies. The technology gap that had seemed so overwhelming at first was closing rapidly. Human engineers were not just copying alien equipment anymore. They were improving it. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a materials scientist from Brazil, made the breakthrough that changed everything. Working in a hidden laboratory in the Amazon, she discovered that the crystalline power sources in Vethkai weapons could be grown in a laboratory using modified bacteria. The aliens have been mining these crystals from rare asteroid deposits, she explained in a video message that was broadcast to resistance cells worldwide. They think they are irreplaceable, but I can grow them in a tank. Any tank. We can make our own. Within weeks, humans were manufacturing their own energy weapons. The crude versions were unstable and prone to overheating, but they worked. And more importantly, they proved that humanity was not just surviving anymore. They were adapting. Commander Sylveth made the decision that she knew would end her career and possibly her life. She ordered a withdrawal. Pull all ground forces back to the ships, she commanded. We will bomb their population centers from orbit until they surrender. Commander, her tactical officer said carefully, if we destroy their cities, there will be nothing left to conquer. The resources, the labor force, everything we came here for will be lost. Better to lose the prize than to lose the war. The withdrawal was chaos. Vethkai troops who had been fighting for 3 months tried to reach their extraction points, while humans harried them every step of the way. Thousands more aliens died in the retreat, picked off by snipers, blown apart by improvised explosives, overwhelmed by sheer numbers of attackers who no longer feared their weapons. But most of them made it back to the ships, and when the last dropship docked with the fleet, Commander Sylveth gave the order she had hoped she would never have to give. Target their largest cities, fire at will. The first orbital bombardment hit Tokyo. The beam of energy that descended from the sky was visible across the entire Pacific Ocean, a pillar of white light that turned everything beneath it to ash. 3 million people died in less than a second. Ancient temples, modern skyscrapers, ordinary homes where families had lived for generations, all of it gone in the blink of an eye. The second bombardment hit New York, then London, then Moscow, each strike announced by a flash of light that could be seen from space, followed by a mushroom cloud of vaporized city rising into the atmosphere. The world watched in horror as city after city was erased from existence. All the courage, all the fighting, All the sacrifices seemed meaningless against an enemy who could simply reach down from the sky and kill millions with the touch of a button. What good was a rifle against a weapon that could destroy a continent? Despair spread across the planet. Some people gave up, retreating into bunkers to wait for the end. Others continued to fight, but with less hope than before. It seemed like the war was already lost. For the first time since the invasion began, humanity started to lose hope. But not everyone. Deep beneath a mountain in Colorado, a team of scientists and engineers had been working on something since the first day of the invasion. They had known from the beginning that fighting on the ground would not be enough. They had known that eventually, humanity would have to take the battle to the stars. General Williams stood in the control room, watching as technicians made final preparations on a device that should not have existed. It was based on Vethkai technology, but modified, improved, made something new by human ingenuity. It was a ship drive, faster than light. "Is it ready?" he asked. The lead engineer, a young woman named Priya Sharma who had lost her entire family in the bombardment of New Delhi, looked up from her console. There were tears on her cheeks, but her voice was steady. "It is ready." They had only been able to build one drive. They had only been able to fit it to one ship, a modified space shuttle that had been in a museum until 3 weeks ago. They had only enough power for one jump. But one was all they needed. The plan was simple and insane. They would jump directly into the middle of the Vethkai fleet, close enough to Commander Sylvath's flagship that the aliens could not fire without destroying their own ships. Then they would deliver their payload. The payload was not a weapon. It was something far more dangerous. It was a message. The Vethkai had made their greatest mistake not when they invaded Earth, but when they did it in secret. The Galactic Council did not know what was happening. If they did, they would be forced to respond. Even a Category 7 planet was protected by certain basic laws, and unprovoked genocide violated all of them. The modified shuttle, now named Hope by its crew of 12 volunteers, launched from a hidden base and jumped into hyperspace. For 3 seconds, which felt like 3 years to everyone on board, the universe twisted around them. Then they were there, appearing directly beside the Vethkai flagship. Commander Sylvath barely had time to process what was happening before the humans broadcast their message. Not to her, but to everyone. To every ship in the fleet, to every monitoring station in the galaxy, to the Galactic Council itself. The message contained everything. Images of the invasion, records of the atrocities, documentation of every war crime the Vethkai had committed, and at the end, a simple statement from the people of Earth. "We are humanity. We were attacked without provocation. We defended ourselves. We ask for nothing but the chance to survive. But if the galaxy will not help us, then we will help ourselves. We have learned your technology. We will learn more. And if the Vethkai destroy us, they will pay for it for the rest of time. Remember us." The broadcast lasted only 30 seconds before Vethkai jamming blocked it. But 30 seconds was enough. Across the galaxy, species who had never heard of Earth were suddenly paying attention. The Galactic Council, which had dismissed humans as irrelevant primitives, was forced to call an emergency session. And the Vethkai, who had expected an easy conquest, realized that they were now standing in the spotlight of the entire universe. Commander Sylvath could have destroyed the human ship. She almost did. But she hesitated for just a moment too long, and in that moment, her tactical officer reported something that made her blood run cold. "Commander, we are receiving transmissions from the Council. They are demanding an explanation. They are threatening sanctions." The shuttle Hope had survived. Its crew were captured, taken aboard the flagship as prisoners, but they had accomplished their mission. The universe now knew about Earth. And the universe was watching. The halls of the Galactic Council had not seen such chaos in 1,000 years. Representatives from dozens of species shouted at each other. their translators struggling to keep up with the flood of accusations and demands. At the center of it all stood High Chancellor Moravine, her crystalline form flickering with stress. "Order," she called out, her musical voice amplified to painful levels. "There will be order." The chamber slowly quieted. On the main display, images from Earth played on a loop, cities burning, people dying, and through it all, humans fighting back with a ferocity that seemed to shock the assembled delegates. "The Vethkai have violated 17 separate articles of the Galactic Compact," Moravine said once silence had been restored. "Unprovoked invasion, mass civilian casualties, destruction of cultural heritage sites, the list goes on." Ambassador Vrechtel, who had been so dismissive of Earth just months ago, rose to speak. "The humans were classified Category 7. They were outside the protection of the Compact." "That is technically correct," Moravine admitted. "However, the methods used by the Vethkai go beyond any acceptable standard of warfare. The orbital bombardments alone have killed over 50 million sentient beings." The number hung in the air. Even among species who lived for thousands of years, 50 million was not a small number. "Furthermore," the High Chancellor continued, "the humans have demonstrated capabilities far beyond what our initial survey suggested. Their rapid adaptation of Vethkai technology is unprecedented. We must consider the possibility that our classification system is fundamentally flawed." General Krathuum, who had called humans soft and weak, clicked his mandibles nervously. "What do you propose?" "I propose we intervene." The words caused another uproar. Council intervention in a military conflict was extraordinarily rare. It meant committing ships, troops, resources. It meant choosing sides. "The Vethkai have a fleet of 200 warships," someone pointed out. "We cannot simply demand they withdraw." "No," Moravine agreed. "But we can make clear the consequences of continuing their campaign: full economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and if necessary, military response." The vote took 3 days. During that time, they continued their bombardment of Earth, destroying another dozen cities and killing millions more. But they were also watching the Council debates with growing concern. Commander Sylvath knew that if the Council decided to intervene, her position would become untenable. She also knew that she had come too far to back down now. "We must finish this quickly," she told her officers. "Before the Council can act, destroy their remaining population centers, break their will to resist." But even as she gave the order, reports were coming in from the surface that made her wonder if breaking humanity's will was even possible. On Earth, the survivors of the bombardments had not collapsed into despair as expected. Instead, they had grown more determined. Underground cities were being carved out of rock. Hidden factories were producing weapons at an incredible rate. And most surprising of all, the captured crew of the Shuttle Hope had not been forgotten. A rescue mission was being planned. Major Chen Wei was chosen to lead the mission, not because he was the best soldier available, but because he had the most to lose. His sister, Dr. Sarah Chen, was one of the 12 crew members being held on the Vethkai flagship. "The Council is debating," he told his team of 50 volunteers. "They might help us, they might not. Either way, we are not leaving our people in alien hands." The plan was based on the same principle that had guided human resistance from the beginning: do the unexpected. The Vethkai knew that humans could not survive in space without protection. They knew that humans had no ships capable of reaching the fleet. They knew that any rescue attempt was impossible. They were wrong. Dr. Rodriguez's crystal growing technique had been refined in the months since the invasion. Human engineers had learned to create not just power sources, but entire drive systems. They were crude, inefficient, and dangerous, but they worked. 3 small craft, barely larger than cars, launched from hidden bases on 3 different continents. Each one carried 16 soldiers in vacuum suits that had been improvised from diving equipment and salvaged Vethkai armor. They had enough air for 2 hours and enough fuel for a one-way trip. The Vethkai sensors never detected them. The craft were too small, too primitive to register as threats. They slipped through gaps in the fleet's defensive perimeter like mice sneaking into a lion's den. The assault on the flagship began at exactly midnight Greenwich Mean Time. The 3 craft latched onto the hull simultaneously, their magnetic locks engaging with a clang that echoed through the alien corridors. Plasma cutters, another human innovation based on reverse-engineered Vethkai technology, burned through the hull plating in seconds. The humans inside the craft wore suits cobbled together from a dozen different sources, diving helmets sealed with industrial adhesive, armor plates torn from dead Vethkai soldiers, oxygen tanks from fire stations. It was not pretty, it was not elegant, but it worked. Alarms screamed throughout the ship. Vethkai soldiers rushed to respond, but they were confused. Multiple breaches, multiple intruders, and the attackers were not behaving like any enemy they had faced before. They did not move in standard tactical formations. They did not stop to secure areas behind them. They just kept pushing forward, always forward, with a single-minded determination that seemed almost insane. Because the humans were not trying to capture the ship, they were not trying to destroy it. They had one goal and one goal only: get their people back. Major Chen's team cut through the ship like a surgical instrument, using captured Vethkai weapons and improvised explosives to clear every corridor between them and the detention block. They took casualties, of course. A third of them died in the first 5 minutes, but the rest kept going, driven by something the Vethkai simply could not understand. They would not leave anyone behind. Commander Sylvath watched the chaos unfold on her bridge displays and felt the unfamiliar emotion of fear growing stronger with each passing moment. These humans, these supposedly primitive creatures, had infiltrated her flagship. They were fighting their way through her best troops, and they were winning. "Seal the detention block," she ordered. "Kill the prisoners if necessary. Do not let them be rescued." But it was too late. Major Chen's team had already reached the cells. Sarah Chen looked up as the door exploded inward, and for the first time in 3 months, she smiled. "Took you long enough," she said to her brother. Traffic was bad. The escape was even more chaotic than the assault. Alarms, explosions, running battles through twisting corridors. 8 more humans died. But when the surviving craft detached from the flagship and burned for Earth, they carried all 12 of the original Hope crew. Commander Sylvath watched them go and knew that something fundamental had changed. The humans had not just rescued their people. They had proven something to the entire galaxy. They had proven that they could hurt her, in her own ship, at the heart of her own fleet. And if they could do that, what else might they be capable of? The council vote came through the next morning. By a margin of 8-4, the Galactic Council had decided to intervene in the Earth conflict. The Vethkai were given 48 hours to withdraw their forces or face the combined military might of the 8 supporting species. Commander Sylvath received the ultimatum with what might have been called grace if there had been any witnesses. She dismissed her officers, locked herself in her quarters, and for several hours simply sat in silence, contemplating the ruin of everything she had worked for. She had been promised glory. She had been promised that this would be the beginning of Vethkai dominance over the galaxy. Instead, she had lost over 100,000 soldiers, damaged the reputation of her species beyond repair, and united the galaxy against her. All because she had underestimated a planet full of soft, fragile, short-lived creatures who refused to know when they were beaten. The withdrawal was not a defeat. That was what the Vethkai leadership would claim. It was a strategic redeployment, a tactical adjustment, a response to changing diplomatic circumstances. But everyone in the galaxy knew the truth. Humanity had won. Not alone, of course. The Council's ultimatum had forced the final decision, but everyone who had been watching knew that without human resistance, without human ingenuity, without human courage, the Council would never have had anything to save. On Earth, the news of the Vethkai withdrawal spread like wildfire. In underground shelters and hidden bunkers, in refugee camps and improvised hospitals, people who had spent months fighting for survival allowed themselves to hope again. General Williams stood on a hillside overlooking what had once been Denver and watched the last Vethkai ships rise toward the sky. Beside him stood Dr. Chen, Major Chen, and dozens of others who had become heroes of the resistance. "Is it over?" someone asked. Williams shook his head. "No, this is just the beginning." He was right. The Vethkai were gone, but Earth would never be the same. Billions had died. Cities had been erased. The old world with its borders and rivalries and petty conflicts was gone forever. But something new was being born. 3 months after the withdrawal, representatives from every nation on Earth gathered in Geneva for the first meeting of the United Earth Council. There were no flags on display except one, a simple image of the planet as seen from space, blue and white and beautiful against the darkness. "We have learned a hard lesson," the Secretary General said in his opening address. "We learned that we are not alone in the universe. We learned that some of our neighbors are hostile, but we also learned something else, something more important." He paused, looking out at the assembled delegates. "We learned what we are capable of when we stand together." The Council's first act was to establish a unified defense force. The second was to create a global science initiative, pooling resources from every nation to advance human technology as rapidly as possible. The third was to reach out to the Galactic Council and request official contact. High Chancellor Moravine personally oversaw the delegation that arrived on Earth 6 months later. She had followed the human resistance with growing amazement, and she was curious to meet these beings who had defied all expectations. The meeting took place in New Geneva, the city that had been built on the ruins of the old one. The human representatives were led by General Williams, who had become something of a symbol of human resistance. "You surprised us," Moravine said through her translator. "All of us. We thought we understood what you were capable of. We were wrong." "With respect, Chancellor," Williams replied, "you made the same mistake the Vethkai made. You looked at our technology, our lifespans, our physical limitations. You measured everything about us except what matters most." "And what is that?" Williams smiled. "Our stubbornness, our refusal to accept the impossible, our ability to find hope even in the darkest moments." He paused. "We are not the strongest species in the galaxy. We are not the smartest. We are not the oldest. But we have something that your surveys cannot measure. We have heart." Moravine considered this for a long moment. In her thousands of years of existence, she had encountered many species. Some had been powerful, some had been wise, but she had never met a species quite like this one. "The Council has voted to upgrade your classification," she said finally. "Earth is no longer Category 7. You have been granted provisional membership in the Galactic Compact, with full membership to be considered in 10 years. It was an unprecedented move. No species had ever been promoted from Category 7 directly to provisional membership. It usually took thousands of years of development, careful observation, gradual integration. But humanity had proven that they were not like other species. The years that followed were years of rebuilding and growth. Human technology advanced at a rate that astounded the galaxy. Within a decade, they had developed their own faster-than-light drives, their own energy weapons, their own space stations and colonies. They absorbed knowledge from the older species like sponges, adapting and improving everything they learned. And they did not forget. Monuments were built to the billions who had died in the invasion. Every child learned the history of those terrible months, learned the names of the heroes who had fought and died, learned what humanity was capable of when pushed to the breaking point. The Vethkai Empire, meanwhile, collapsed under the weight of sanctions and isolation. Commander Sylveth was tried for war crimes and spent the rest of her long life in a prison on a frozen moon, with plenty of time to contemplate her mistakes. She was not the only one. Across the galaxy, species that had dismissed Earth as irrelevant began to reconsider. The little blue planet with its fragile, short-lived inhabitants had become something unexpected. Not a threat exactly, not an enemy, but something to be respected. Perhaps even feared. 50 years after the invasion, humanity took its place as a full member of the Galactic Council. The ceremony was held on the new space station orbiting Earth, a massive structure that would have seemed like magic to the humans of a century before. Ambassador Sarah Chen, who had been a physicist when the aliens first appeared and had spent the decades since helping to lead humanity into the stars, gave the acceptance speech. "We are here today because we refused to accept what the universe told us we were," she said. "We were told we were primitive. We proved them wrong. We were told we were weak. We proved them wrong. We were told we were insignificant. We proved them wrong." She looked out at the gathered representatives of 100 species, all of them watching her with expressions that ranged from respect to wariness to something that might have been awe. The universe underestimated Earth. The Vethkai learned why that was their greatest mistake, and now we stand here among you as equals, not because we are the strongest or the oldest or the wisest, but because we never, ever give up. The applause lasted for a long time. General Williams, now ancient and gray but still standing straight, watched from the front row with tears streaming down his weathered face. He remembered the darkest days, when it seemed like everything was lost. He remembered the friends he had buried, the impossible choices he had been forced to make, the moments when giving up would have been so much easier than going on. But they had not given up. They had never given up. In the years and centuries that followed, humanity would face many more challenges. There would be other conflicts, other threats, other moments when it seemed like all was lost. Species that resented the rapid rise of these young upstarts would plot against them. Cosmic disasters would threaten their colonies. The universe would test them again and again. But they would face them the same way they had faced the Vethkai. Together with courage, with hope, and with the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had carried them from the caves to the stars. The children of Earth spread across the galaxy, building new homes on distant worlds, forging alliances with species that became true friends. They brought with them the lessons of those terrible months, the knowledge of what they were capable of when pushed to the breaking point. And they brought something else too, a message for any who might think to challenge them. The universe had underestimated Earth. It would not make that mistake again.